why can't women be priests? And since women cannot be priests, how can they serve the church in higher positions of power? That's a good question. But okay, let's start with the first one. Why can't women be priests? In a sense, the only reason that the church has ever given that women cannot be priests is that the church does not have the authority to ordain women. This is what has constantly been repeated in the popes, in their declarations. Not because they don't want to, or not because they think there's something deficient about, women or anything like that. It's because the church has a duty to protect the tradition. And now, the word tradition obviously has all these connotations, like some people think it's just like something that we like, that we want to hold on to. But the reality is that for the church, the only thing we have is tradition. What that means is that we have received something from Christ. We have received some teachings, we have received some sacraments from Him. And our only duty is to protect what He has given us. We can try to learn what He has given us, and over time we discovered that certain things that He has given us have not been sort of explored or understood, and we may learn more about that, but we can never add or remove anything from what He has given us, because Christ is the revelation of God. He Himself is the truth. Whatever He says, whatever He's done, whatever He's told us, is the fullness of what God wanted to say to us. And so if we add anything to that, that means that we are adding something that is foreign to revelation, to what God has spoken to us. And if we take away something, that means we are, neglecting or denying something that He has given us. And so one of the more fundamental things is about the priesthood. Christ developed the priesthood. He gave us this gift of the priesthood as a sacrament of service for the church. The word minister, for instance, nowadays it has certain connotation of being, the head of a congregation. But the word minister actually means in Latin, it means servant. It means to be a servant to a household, right? So in the household of God, the priests are the ministers, the priests are the servants. And the Pope, for instance, one of his most important titles is called the servant of the servants of God. So the Pope does not claim, or should not claim anyhow, to be the head in the way that he is, an authority figure over the church, but he is there to serve. And he is there to serve the servants so that they may serve well the people. So in this way, the church is not there to determine or, to decide its own things, but it just tells us what Christ has told us. And having examined what God has given us, what Christ has given us, it does not see in any way that Christ has allowed us the authority or the right to ordain women as priests. And we cannot change that. We have no right to do that. So, what other roles are there for women in these positions of power, we may say? Again, we don't think of them as positions of power because, again, the whole point of being a Christian in any way is to serve, right? But what roles are there? There are many roles, actually. In some ways there are more hidden roles, which, you might see sometimes in the history of the church. There are women who are great saints. Those are not so much hidden, but often the great saints in the church, like Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint Therese of Lisieux, for instance, they were cloistered nuns. And you think, like, as a cloistered nun, what kind of influence could you have? You hardly meet people, you hardly talk to anyone. How could you have such a great influence? And yet somehow, through their little role in society, in their little convents, they've had a tremendous impact on the entire church. Saint Therese of Lisieux, for instance, she's called the co-patroness of the missions. And it's strange to think of a missionary as someone who has spent her entire life in the same city in a convent. Like, a mission is all about going to a foreign country, it seems, isn't it? So how could this woman this young girl really, who has spent her entire life in one small place, be considered a patron of the missions? And it's because, again, that influence that she exercised over the entire church, that her teaching, even from her small house, her little cell, whatever she has written, all her teachings have had such a great impact on the church that so many popes, so many doctors of the church So many teachers, I mean, in the church have been struck by her, and they've been influenced by her. So much so that the greatest theologians, who have educations and degrees much greater than St. Therese could have imagined to have had, they are learning from her what the church really means and what the church teaches. And so there's that side to it, you know, where we have these great teachers who are so hidden, these doctors of the church. There's another side too, in which the women in our society today, they have the ability to be theologians, and we have some great theologians actually who are women. One of whom I've already mentioned, Alice von Hildebrand. She has focused a lot on sort of more philosophical, but also a little bit on theology. And her teachings have influenced greatly, you know, our understanding of femininity, of what it means to be a woman. One of the other, my own personal favorites is Saint Edith Stein, or Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. I have been fascinated with her teachings, with her brilliance, because she was driven by a great desire for the truth. And that truth, that desire, was relentless. You know, she never stopped at anything. You know, if something confused her, she dug to the depths of it to figure out what was this about. And her influence was significant on someone like Pope John Paul II. You know, he even quotes her in one of his encyclicals, Fides et Ratio, you know, on faith and reason, because she was one of those who understood deeply the connection between philosophy and theology. You know, how we think of the world and how we think of God. And so we have these women who are significant teachers, and even in the sort of professorial streams, you know, they are professors, they have their doctorates, things like that, and then, so they've had an influence even in academia, in the church. There are other ways too in which women are, and it may not be so much through academia, through being theologians in the church, but sometimes they are called to give witness to what they believe, to what they know to be true. And this happens more likely in smaller churches, in local parishes, you know. Many of the key figures in the local parish are the women, because the women are the ones who go to church more often than men, you know. They tend to be the ones who have a great say, a great influence on how the parish is run, the direction that it takes. And this is, again, not insignificant. What other positions are there? In terms of the hierarchy of the church, because I think most people are concerned about the hierarchy, you know, this sort of official, institutional side of the church. And I think, like, what can women do there? Well, some women they hold positions of authority in various departments of the diocese, various dioceses. Some can be even like chancellors, sometimes of temporal, and I believe maybe of spiritual affairs, but don't quote me on that. But they have this ability to be appointed to these high roles even within the institutional hierarchy of the church. So there is that. They cannot be ordained because we don't have the authority to do that, but they do have the ability to influence the direction that the church takes, and in fact they do have a great influence. I mentioned before the influence of motherhood, but even in a more direct way, they have a say, you know, in how the church functions and how the church thinks about its own teachings. So that is the church's response to this sort of thirst in society to see a greater involvement of women.